The River Thames did not run clean in 1780. It moved slowly through a city that no longer recognized itself, carrying with it the runoff of 10,000 new chimneys, the waste of overcrowded tenements, and the blood of an economy rewriting its own rules. The water was dark, the air was darker, and somewhere beneath the coal smoke, beneath the hammering of iron foundries that never stopped, beneath the cries of children working 14-hour shifts in mills they had never chosen, somewhere beneath all of it, an entire civilization was being dismantled and rebuilt in a single generation. This is not a story about progress. This is a story about what happens when a city becomes the engine of the world and what it costs the people forced to feed it. In 1700, London was already the largest city in Europe. But large did not mean modern. It was crowded. It meant ancient systems stretched past breaking point. The city at the turn of the century was a place of wooden houses, open sewers, and a rhythm of life that had not fundamentally changed in centuries. A merchant in 1700 operated in a world not so different from one in 1500. Goods were made by hand. Trade moved at the speed of a horse or a barge. A craftsman learned his skill over years of apprenticeship, working in his own workshop or his own home, producing cloth, iron, leather, or wood at a pace dictated by his own body and the light of the day. London's economy in 1700 was built on trade. The city sat at the mouth of the Thames, one of the most navigable rivers in Europe. It and its ports connected it to an empire that stretched across the globe. Sugar came in from the Caribbean, cotton came from India, wool was woven domestically by hand. The city was wealthy, but its wealth was fragile, dependent on the labor of millions working in small workshops, in homes, in fields outside the city walls. The countryside fed London. Villages within a day's ride supplied grain, livestock, and timber. Workers in those villages lived as their grandparents had. They woke up with the sun. They worked the land or practiced a trade. They answered to no clock, no foreman, no factory whistle. Life was hard. Poverty was common. But it was a poverty embedded in a familiar rhythm, one that had sustained human societies for 10,000 years. That rhythm was about to break. To understand how, we must look at what London was sitting on, not figuratively, but literally. Beneath the cobblestones and the timber houses, beneath the coal yards and the docks, the geology of southern England held something extraordinary. Coal, centuries of compressed organic matter, locked deep underground, waiting. For most of history, coal was used sparingly for drying hops, for burning in a handful of furnaces. It was considered a dirty, crude fuel. Wood was preferred, but wood had limits. A nation could only burn so many forests before the trees stopped growing faster than they fell. By 1700, England had already begun to feel that limit. The forests of the Midlands were thinning. Charcoal, the fuel that powered iron smelting, was becoming expensive. Industries that depended on wood were beginning to strain. The solution was already underfoot. It simply had not yet been unlocked. The transformation that would consume London did not begin in London. It began in the coal fields of the Midlands, in the iron foundries of Shropshire, in the textile villages of Lancashire, places far from the grand houses of Mayfair and the counting houses of the city. These were places of mud, soot, and quiet desperation, where men descended into narrow shafts hundreds of feet underground to extract the black stone that was slowly becoming the most valuable commodity in Britain. Coal mining in the early 1700s was brutal work. The shafts were dark, cramped, and prone to flooding. Water seeped constantly into the tunnels, and the only way to remove it was by hand using buckets carried up ladders by women and children, or by crude pumps powered by horses walking in endless circles on the surface. The work killed men regularly. Cave-ins, explosions of methane gas and suffocation were common, but coal was becoming essential, and the men kept going down. The first threat of the revolution was not a machine. It was a problem. As mines went deeper, the flooding grew worse. Traditional pumps could not keep pace. Entire sections of productive coal deposits were being abandoned because there was no way to drain them. The economic pressure was immense. Mine owners needed a solution, or they needed to stop digging. That solution arrived in 1712, in a muddy field in Nottinghamshire, in the form of a machine built by a man named Thomas Newcomen. Newcomen's engine was not elegant. It was a towering iron and timber structure that sat at the mouth of a mine shaft like a mechanical sentinel. It worked by heating water into steam inside a cylinder, then rapidly cooling it to create a vacuum, which pulled a piston downward, which lifted water out of the mine through a series of rods and chains. It was slow. It was inefficient. It consumed enormous amounts of coal, but it worked, and that was enough. Within a decade, Newcomen engines were spreading across the coal fields of England. Each one opened up new depths, new veins, new deposits. Coal production began to climb, and as coal became more available, it became cheaper, and as it became cheaper, other industries began to notice. This was the seed. Small, technical, buried in the mud of a Midlands mine, but it carried within it the potential to reshape every system of human labor that had existed since the invention of the plow. The seed had been planted. Now it needs soil. The spread of industrialization was not an accident. It was the product of systems economic, political, and social that had been quietly assembling in Britain for decades before the first factory was built. The first system was agricultural. In the early 1700s, Britain was already undergoing an agricultural revolution. New techniques, crop rotation, selective breeding, mechanical seed drills were producing more food with fewer hands. This was not a gentle transition. It was enforced, often violently, through the enclosure of common lands. Families who had farmed the same fields for generations were told that the land now belonged to a single owner. They were given small plots or nothing at all. Hundreds of thousands of people were pushed off the land they had worked, not by drought or famine, but by law. They needed work, and the cities were beginning to offer it. The second system was financial. Britain in the 1700s had developed something no other nation possessed to the same degree: a functioning system of credit. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, allowed entrepreneurs to borrow capital at relatively low interest rates. Joint stock companies owned by many investors allowed risk to be shared. Patent law, though imperfect, gave inventors a temporary monopoly on their creations. These were not glamorous institutions. They were quiet, bureaucratic, and largely invisible to ordinary people. But they created an environment in which a man with an idea and no money could, for the first time in history, find the funding to turn that idea into a machine. The third system was the empire. In 1733, John Kay invented the flying shuttle, a device that allowed a weaver to pass the shuttle across the loom with one hand, doubling the speed of weaving. But this immediately created a crisis. Weavers could now consume yarn faster than spinners could produce it. The bottleneck was at the spinning wheel. For decades, inventors worked on the problem. In 1764, James Hargreaves created the spinning jenny, a hand-powered machine that could spin multiple threads at once. It was small enough to fit in a cottage. It was a tool, not a factory machine, but it was the first step. Then came Richard Arkwright and the water frame. This machine required the power of a rushing river to operate. It could not fit in a home. It needed a purpose-built building, a mill staffed by multiple workers running continuously. Arkwright built the first cotton mill at Cromford in 1771. It was not the end of the cottage industry, but it was the beginning of the end. By the 1780s, James Watt had refined the steam engine into a rotative machine, one that could turn wheels, drive shafts, and power looms. For the first time, a factory did not need to be built beside a river. It could be built anywhere coal was cheap and labor was available. And in London and the cities around it, labor was becoming very available indeed. The systems that had built Britain's industrial capacity were now feeding each other in a loop that grew tighter with every decade. Agricultural enclosure pushed workers into cities. Cities created demand for manufactured goods. Demand drove innovation. Innovation created factories. Factories needed workers. And the cycle continued. No single person designed this system. No single government planned it. It emerged from the interaction of thousands of individual decisions by farmers, by factory owners, by inventors, by investors, each acting in their own interest, each unaware of the full shape of what they were building together. The breakdown did not arrive as a single event. It arrived as a slow accumulation of small collapses in the bodies of workers, in the structure of families, in the layout of cities, in the meaning of work itself, until the world that had existed before was simply gone, replaced by something so different that the people living inside it could barely remember what had come before. London in the 1780s and 1790s was already beginning to buckle. The population was growing faster than the city could absorb it. Workers from the countryside, displaced by enclosure, arrived by the thousands each year. They came with skills suited to a rural world, plowing, harvesting, tending animals, and found those skills worthless in a city that wanted hands, not craftsmen. The jobs available were simple, repetitive, and poorly paid. They were jobs inside factories, inside mills, inside foundries. Housing was the first system to fail. There was no plan for where these people would live. Landlords subdivided existing houses into smaller and smaller units. Rooms that had once housed a single family were divided by thin wooden partitions into spaces barely large enough for a man to lie down. Basements were filled, attics were filled, alleys were filled with hastily constructed shanties of wood and mud, open to the sky, with no water supply and no sanitation. By the 1790s, some neighborhoods in London had a density that defied belief. Families of 6 or 8 lived in a single room. Children slept on the floor beside open sewage channels. The smell in summer was indescribable. Diseases spread with devastating speed. Typhoid, dysentery, and smallpox moved through the slums like fire through dry timber. In some parishes, more than half of all children died before their 5th birthday. The second system to collapse was the structure of work itself. In the rural world, work had followed the rhythm of the seasons in the body. A man worked hard during planting and harvest. He rested during winter. He answered to no one but the weather and the land. In the factory, none of this applied. The factory demanded punctuality. It demanded consistency. It demanded that a human being perform the same motion hundreds of times an hour for 12 or 14 hours, 6 days a week, without variation and without rest. The pace was set not by the worker, but by the machine. If a man slowed, the machine did not slow with him. The foreman was there to ensure that it did not. This was a revolution in the meaning of labor. For the first time in history, human beings were expected to function like components in a mechanism interchangeable, predictable, and disposable. Now, the third collapse was among children. Child labor was not new. In the countryside, children had always worked feeding animals, scaring birds from crops and carrying water. But rural child labor was tied to the family. A child worked alongside parents in the open air, doing tasks suited to small hands and young bodies. Factory child labor was something else entirely. Children as young as 5 or 6 were employed in the cotton mills of Manchester and the foundries of Birmingham. Their small fingers were valued for threading broken bobbins, for reaching into the narrow spaces between moving machinery that no adult hand could enter. They were called scavengers and pieces. They worked the same hours as adults. They were paid a fraction of an adult's wage. They were beaten for slowness. They were injured constantly, fingers crushed, hands torn, bodies broken by machines that did not know or care what was feeding them. The apprenticeship system, which had once been the primary way that children learned a trade, began to function as something closer to a system of indentured servitude. Parish authorities in rural areas, overwhelmed by poverty, sent their poorest children sometimes in batches to mill owners in distant cities. The children were housed in cramped dormitories above the factory floor. They worked from dawn until they could no longer see. Some never returned home. The fourth collapse was moral. The people who owned the factories were not, for the most part, monsters. Many of them believed sincerely that they were providing employment, that they were lifting the poor out of idleness, that the wages they paid, however small, were better than starvation. And in many cases, this was technically true. But the system they were building did not care about intentions. It cared about output. The logic of the factory was relentless. Cut wages, extend hours, hire cheaper labor, replace workers who could not keep pace. The pressure was not moral, it was economic, and it operated on everyone inside its owners as much as workers. A factory owner who paid higher wages or reduced hours than his competitors would lose customers, lose orders, and eventually close. The system punished compassion and rewarded efficiency. This was the deepest collapse of all, not a failure of individuals, but a failure of the entire framework within which individuals operated. The old moral order, in which a lord had some obligation to his tenants, in which a master craftsman had some duty to his apprentice, was dissolving. In its place was a new order, governed not by custom or conscience, but by the price of cotton, the cost of coal, and the speed of the loom. By 1800, the world that had existed at the century's beginning was gone. Not gradually, not gently. It had been torn apart by a force that no one had fully understood, fully predicted, or fully intended, and replaced by something that would take generations to learn to live inside. The damage was not only physical. A generation of workers, men, women, and children had been moved from one world into another without any preparation, any explanation, or any choice. They had not asked to be displaced from their villages. They had not asked to stand beside a machine for 14 hours a day. They had not asked for their children to crawl beneath iron frames in the dark. And yet here they were, inside a system that demanded everything from them and offered in return only enough to survive. The psychological toll of this dislocation was profound, though it was rarely documented in the language we would use today. Workers arriving in London or Manchester from the countryside experienced something close to what we might now call cultural annihilation. The rhythms, the relationships, the sense of place and purpose that had defined their lives, all of it was stripped away. In the village, a man was known. He had a name, a reputation, a role. In the city, he was a pair of hands. He was interchangeable. He could be replaced tomorrow by another man arriving from another village, willing to work for less. This anonymity bred despair. Alcoholism was rampant in the industrial cities of the late 1700s. Gin, cheap and available, became a refuge for workers who had no other escape from the grinding monotony of factory life. The gin shops of London and the alehouses of Manchester were not merely places of leisure. They were places where men went to forget. Religion took on new weight. The Methodist movement, which spread rapidly among industrial workers in the late 18th century, and offered something the factory could not: a sense of dignity, of community, of meaning beyond the production of cloth. Methodist chapels appeared in every industrial town. They gave workers a space that was not owned by a factory master, a place where they were valued not as laborers but as souls. But religion also carried a darker implication. For many workers, the suffering of this life was bearable only if it was balanced by justice in the next. The idea that God would reward the meek and punish the exploiter became not merely a belief but a survival mechanism, a way of enduring what could not be changed. Among the educated classes, the moral consequences manifested differently. Writers and philosophers began to recoil at what they saw. William Blake, watching the factories rise across England, coined the phrase "dark satanic mills," not as metaphor, but as literal description. The Romantic poets mourned the loss of the natural world, the countryside, the quiet dignity of rural life. They saw in the factory system not progress, but a kind of violence against the human spirit. Friedrich Engels, visiting Manchester decades later, would document the conditions with clinical precision. The open sewers, the overcrowded housing, the child labor, the life expectancy that fell below 40 in some districts. But the first witnesses in the 1780s and 1790s were less systematic. They wrote letters, they kept diaries, or they recorded what they saw with a mixture of horror and helplessness. Some saw the problem and believed it could be fixed. Robert Owen, a Welsh-born mill owner, visited the mills of New Lanark in Scotland and decided to prove that a factory could be both profitable and humane. He reduced working hours. He built schools for workers' children. He raised wages. He created a community in which workers lived in decent housing with access to clean water and education. New Lanark was not utopia, but it was proof that the system did not have to destroy everyone inside it. Others saw the problem and concluded that the entire system was rotten. Thomas Malthus argued that population would always outstrip food production, condemning the poor to perpetual misery regardless of how much wealth was created. Karl Marx, writing in the following century, and would look back at these decades and see the birth of a class war that had not yet found its language. The moral consequence that cut deepest was this: For the first time in the history of Western civilization, there existed a system of economic production in which the suffering of millions was not accidental but structural. It was not caused by war, famine, or plague. It was caused by the rational, deliberate decisions of men and women pursuing profit within a system that rewarded the exploitation of labor and punished any individual who chose to act otherwise. This realization that poverty could be a feature of prosperity, that suffering could coexist with wealth, would take generations to fully absorb, and its consequences would shape every political and social movement of the 19th and 20th centuries. The system did not collapse. This is the part of the story that is hardest to tell because it contains no single dramatic turning point, no revolution, no liberation, no moment in which the machines were stopped and the workers were set free. What happened instead was slower, messier, and in many ways more remarkable. The system was gradually, painfully reformed from within. The first reforms came not from compassion, but from self-interest. By the early 1800s, the factory system had begun to produce a workforce so degraded, so malnourished, so poorly educated, so prone to disease that productivity itself was suffering. Children who had worked in mills from age 5 were, by their 20s, physically incapable of sustained labor. Men who had breathed coal dust and cotton fiber for decades died in their 40s. The system was consuming its own fuel. This realization, more than any moral outrage, drove the first factory acts. The Act of 1833 prohibited the employment of children under 9 in textile mills and limited the working day of children under 13 to 9 hours. It was not abolished, it was regulation. But it was the first acknowledgement in law that the state had a responsibility to set boundaries on what could be done to a human being in the name of profit. More acts followed. The hours were reduced, the age limits were raised. Inspectors were appointed to enforce the rules. Each act was fought bitterly by factory owners who argued with some truth that regulation would raise costs and reduce competitiveness. Each act was won slowly by a coalition of reformers, philanthropists, religious leaders, and increasingly the workers themselves. The second great transformation was the rise of organized labor. In the early 1700s, workers had no collective voice. They bargained individually or not at all. The Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800 made it illegal for workers to form associations or strike. The penalty was transportation exile to the colonies. But the acts could not silence the underlying grievance. Workers began to organize anyway, in secret, in the back rooms of alehouses, in the Methodist chapels, in the nascent trade unions that formed and reformed across the industrial towns. The Luddite riots of the early 1800s, in which workers smashed the machines that had destroyed their livelihoods, were the most visible expression of this fury. But they were not the most effective. The most effective response was political. The Chartist movement of the 1830s and 1840s demanded universal male suffrage, the right of working men to vote and to be represented in Parliament. The Chartists marched. They petitioned. They were arrested. They were imprisoned. But the idea they carried that the men who worked the machines should have a voice in the laws that govern them could not be imprisoned. It spread. It grew. And over the following decades, through a series of reform acts, the franchise was gradually extended until, by the end of the 19th century, most working men could vote. The third transformation was in the cities themselves. The cholera epidemic of 1832 killed tens of thousands in London. It was no longer possible to ignore the connection between filthy water, overcrowding, and disease. Engineers and public health reformers like Edwin Chadwick and Joseph Bazalgette began the slow, enormous work of rebuilding the city's infrastructure. New sewers were constructed. Clean water was piped into neighborhoods that had relied on contaminated wells for generations. Parks were built. Streets were widened. The transformation was not complete by the end of the century, but it was a beginning. The fourth transformation was in education. For most of the 1700s, the vast majority of working-class children received no formal education at all. Sunday schools, run largely by religious organizations, taught reading, but only so that children could read scripture. The idea that every child should be educated, not for God, but for the nation, not for salvation, but for citizenship, took decades to gain ground. The Elementary Education Act of 1870 made schooling compulsory for children between 5 and 12. It was a watershed. Within a generation, literacy rates among the working class began to rise sharply. Children who would once have spent their entire lives in a mill began for the first time to read newspapers, to understand politics, to imagine a future different from the one they had been born into. The fifth transformation, and perhaps the most lasting, was in the way Britain understood itself. The Industrial Revolution had made Britain the most powerful nation on earth. Its factories produced more cloth, more iron, and more coal than any other country. Its railways connected its cities, its steamships connected its empire. But the cost of this power, the poverty, the child labor, the environmental devastation, the moral corrosion had become impossible to deny. By the end of the 1800s, a new understanding was emerging. The idea that economic growth alone was sufficient, that wealth, however distributed, represented progress, was beginning to crack. Reformers, politicians, and ordinary citizens were starting to ask a question that the Industrial Revolution had made unavoidable. What kind of society do we want to be? That question has not yet been fully answered, but it was first asked in the smoke and silence of the English Midlands, in the slums of Manchester, in the factories of London, in the minds of men and women who had watched an entire world dissolve and been given no choice but to build a new one in its place. There is a quiet parallel in our own time. Today, the machines are not steam engines and iron looms. They are algorithms and artificial intelligence. The displacement is not from countryside to city, but from familiar work to unfamiliar uncertainty. The speed is faster, the scale is larger, but the structure is remarkably similar to a system of economic production that moves faster than the societies it reshapes, that creates wealth and destroys livelihoods simultaneously, and that demands adaptation from millions of people who never asked for the change. The workers of 1780 did not choose the Industrial Revolution. They did not vote for it. They did not design it. It arrived in their lives as an unstoppable force, and it asked them to become something they had never been before. We are not so different. With the question that the 1700s left unanswered, how do we govern a system that is more powerful than any individual, any community, or any nation, remains open? The tools have changed, the stakes have grown, but the fundamental tension remains the same. Between the speed at which technology reshapes the world and the much slower speed at which human beings learn to live inside the world it creates, London in 1780 was a city in the grip of a transformation it did not fully understand. The smoke hung over the rooftops. The river carried the waste of a civilization remaking itself. And somewhere in that smoke, in that noise, in that chaos, the shape of our modern world was being hammered into existence, one factory, one machine, one human life at a time. The Industrial Revolution did not begin as a revolution. It began as a solution to a problem. Water in a mine shaft, not enough yarn for a loom, not enough wood for a furnace. Small problems, practical problems, the kind of problems that engineers solve every day. But the solutions connected, and the connections multiplied, and what began as a series of quiet, technical innovations became the most profound restructuring of human life since the invention of agriculture itself. We inherited that world. We did not build it. We did not choose it, but we live inside it every single day in ways we rarely stop to examine. The factories are quieter now. The smoke has thinned, but the logic they built, the logic of machines, of efficiency, of production at scale, still runs beneath everything we do. It began in the mud of an English coal field. It ended by rewriting the meaning of what it is to be human. If there is a piece of history you would like me to write next, drop a comment below. I read everyone. I am Mike. I watch the past so we can understand the present, and together we keep history reborn. I will see you in the next era.